Before the sun was even up, a man was already in the saddle. Not because he loved it, not because it was romantic, because if he wasn't, someone would replace him before the week was out. The American cowboy of the 1860s, 70s, and 80s worked up to 18 hours a day, slept in a building crawling with lice, and earned somewhere between $25 and $40 a month doing it. No days off, no sick leave, no union, no contract. Just the horse, the herd, and the weather. And the weather was almost never on his side. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, we cover the real history of the American West, not the Hollywood version. If that sounds like your kind of thing, hit subscribe and stick around, because today we're going inside the actual working life of the cowboy. What he did from the moment he opened his eyes to the moment he collapsed at night. What he ate, where he slept, what could get him killed, and who was really running things on the trail. Picture the American cowboy the way the movies give him to you. He's riding alone across open country. The light is golden. There's no deadline, no boss, and apparently no particular destination. He stops when he feels like it. He sleeps under stars that behave themselves. Somewhere a harmonica is playing. That man did not exist. The real cowboy of the American West, the one documented in journals, ranch ledgers, and the Federal Writers Project interviews of the 1930s, where aging cowboys recalled their working lives. That man was, by any honest measure, a low-wage laborer doing one of the most physically punishing jobs on the continent. And it started before the sun came up. On a working ranch or a trail drive, the cook was already moving before anyone else. He had the fire going and breakfast ready by the time the rest of the crew dragged themselves out of their bedrolls. The menu did not change much. Bacon, beans, sourdough bread or biscuits, black coffee. That was it. If a man wanted something different, he was free to go hungry. Breakfast was fast and functional because the herd didn't wait. By the time the light was gray in the sky, the cowboys were saddled up and working. On a trail drive, each man on the crew rode a rotation of horses, typically 3 or 4 animals assigned to him, because no single horse could sustain the pace of a full day's work across rough country. The horse wrangler, often the youngest and least experienced man on the outfit, was responsible for the entire remuda, the spare herd of horses that traveled alongside the cattle. His job was to have the right horse ready for the right man at the right time. There was no grace period for being slow about it. The drive itself covered roughly 12 to 15 miles a day when conditions were good. The trail boss set the pace, and his word was law. He rode point, out ahead of the herd, scouting the route, locating water, calculating how far the cattle could push before they needed to rest and graze. The cattle's weight mattered enormously. A steer that arrived at the railhead, thin and run down, was worth significantly less than one that had been allowed to graze along the route. The trail boss was always doing that math. Behind him, positioned along the flanks of the herd, were the swing riders and the flank riders, keeping the column moving and preventing the animals from drifting. And at the very back, eating the dust of thousands of hooves, breathing it, wearing it, were the drag riders. Drag was the worst position on the drive. It was assigned to the newest men. The work was to push the slow cattle, the injured ones, the calves, and the stragglers forward through the choking dust at the rear of the herd. Edward C. Teddy Blue Abbott, one of the most reliable first-hand sources on the trail driving era, wrote that he had seen drag riders come off herd with the dust half an inch deep on their hats and thick as fur in their eyebrows. Every single day. But the trail drive, as grueling as it was, represents only a part of the cowboy's year. The rest of it was ranch work, and ranch work, despite having none of the romantic associations of a long drive north, was where most of a cowboy's actual life was spent. Roundup happened twice a year, once in spring to brand the new calves and tally the herd, and once in fall to cut out the cattle bound for market. Between those two roundups, the work was relentless and almost entirely unglamorous. Cowboys mended fences. In the earlier open range years, that meant riding the boundary lines of leased or claimed grazing land. After barbed wire arrived in the late 1870s, it meant stringing and repairing miles of wire in temperatures that could swing from over 100 degrees in a Texas summer to well below zero on a northern plains winter. They broke horses, a violent, exhausting, and sometimes crippling process of taking a green-broke animal and making it reliable enough to work cattle. They hauled water to remote sections of the range during dry spells. They repaired buildings, maintained wagons, and did whatever the ranch required of them. There were no distinctions between skilled and unskilled labor. If it needed doing, a cowboy did it. Weather was a constant opponent. In summer on the southern plains, the heat was something a man had to manage daily. Shade was rare, water was scarce, and sunburn was a permanent condition. In winter in the northern ranges, the situation reversed entirely. Snow, ice, and wind turned the open range into a killing ground. Cowboys rode fence lines and checked on cattle in blizzard conditions with no shelter and nothing more than their coat and their horse between them and the elements. There were no sick days. A man who couldn't ride was a man who couldn't keep his job. The ranching year followed a rhythm that had nothing to do with leisure and everything to do with the cattle market. From the moment the calves dropped in spring to the moment the last steer shipped at the fall railhead, every week had a purpose. And when the drives were done and the market season closed, the ranch still needed tending, and the men still needed feeding, and the work simply continued in a lower gear until the whole cycle started again. This was the cowboy's year. Not adventure, not freedom. A job. On a trail drive, there was one man whose authority exceeded even the trail boss in one specific but absolute domain. And that was the cook. The cook, or the cookie as the hands called him, ran the chuck wagon. The chuck wagon was the nerve center of the entire operation. It carried the food, the medical supplies, the tools, the spare rope, and anything else the outfit needed to survive weeks or months on the open range. Charles Goodnight, the legendary Texas cattleman, is generally credited with designing the first true chuck wagon in 1866, a reinforced wagon with a hinged box at the back that folded down into a working kitchen. The design spread rapidly across the industry because it worked. The cook earned more than the average hand, typically around $75 a month, compared to the hand's $25 to $40, and he earned every cent of it. He was up before anyone else and in bed after everyone else. He cooked 3 meals a day in all conditions, including high wind, driving rain, and lightning. His wagon was also his workspace, and he defended it accordingly. It was understood on every outfit that a cowboy did not ride through the cook's camp area, did not tie a horse to the chuck wagon, and did not help himself to food before the cook said so. These were not polite suggestions. The cook's authority in the camp was effectively absolute, and a man who made an enemy of the cook quickly discovered that there were many ways to make a long drive feel even longer. The food itself was functional and monotonous. Beans were a staple at almost every meal. Sourdough biscuits, often called leavens or sourdough bullets by the hands, were baked in a Dutch oven over a fire. Salted or dried beef was common when fresh wasn't available. Coffee was mandatory and perpetual. Fresh vegetables were rare on the trail. There simply wasn't room or means to carry them, and the result was a diet almost completely lacking in nutritional variety. Cowboys on long drives frequently suffered from scurvy-adjacent symptoms and general physical depletion by the time they reached the end of the trail. Night watches were a further drain on the body. On the drive, the herd had to be monitored through the night to prevent straying and, more critically, stampede. The night guard worked in 2 to 4 hour rotations, riding slowly around the bedded herd in the dark, singing quietly or whistling to keep the cattle calm. It wasn't optional. A man on guard who fell asleep and allowed a stampede was not going to be working for that outfit much longer. So men rode through the night, exhausted, in all weather, week after week. Sleep deprivation was a structural feature of the job, not an exception. There are documented accounts of cowboys rubbing tobacco juice into their eyes to stay awake on night watch. And then there were the stampedes. In terms of sheer danger, nothing on the trail came close. A herd of 2,000 longhorns could go from standing still to a full run in seconds. Thunder was the most common trigger. A bolt of lightning could set off the entire herd instantly. But the cattle were nervous enough that almost anything could do it. A sudden noise, a tumbleweed rolling into the herd at night, a horse shaking itself at the wrong moment. Once the stampede started, the cowboys had to ride into the dark alongside thousands of running animals, trying to get ahead of the lead cattle and push them into a wide circle, a technique called milling, tightening that circle until the herd slowed and stopped. It was some of the most dangerous riding a man could do. Prairie dog holes were everywhere. Dry creek beds appeared without warning in the dark. A horse that stumbled could put a rider directly in the path of the herd. Cowboys also drowned. River crossings were dreaded. The major trails north from Texas crossed multiple rivers: the Red, the Canadian, the Cimarron, the Arkansas. And those rivers could be anything from a calm ford to a raging flood, depending on recent rain. The cattle had to swim across. The horses had to swim. And most cowboys, by all accounts, could not swim at all. A man swept off his horse in a swollen river crossing had very few options. Drowning was a documented and recurring cause of death on the drives. Lightning took men regularly as well. Teddy Blue Abbott wrote of being knocked off his horse by a lightning strike twice over the course of his time on the trail. One Texas trail boss described a single storm in which 5 men were knocked off their feet and 7 horses were struck dead in camp. The Great Plains offered no shelter. A man on horseback in an open field during a summer electrical storm was simply exposed, and there was nothing to be done about it but keep the herd moving. What did not kill cowboys with anything like the frequency the movies would suggest was gunfights. Armed confrontations between cowboys on the trail were statistically rare. The reputation of the Wild West as a place of constant gunplay owes far more to dime novels and later Hollywood productions than to the historical record. A cowboy's real enemies were the river, the lightning, the herd, and the horse. And the horse, more than any other, was the thing most likely to end a man's life on the job. And what do you think? Could you have survived something like that? Working 18-hour days in those conditions, with that kind of danger around every corner? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know. When the trail drive ended or the season wound down, the cowboy returned to the ranch. And the ranch meant the bunkhouse. The bunkhouse has been romanticized in popular culture almost as heavily as the trail itself. The reality was considerably less appealing. Most bunkhouses were small, single-room structures built quickly and cheaply from whatever materials were available. The walls let the wind through. The roof leaked when it rained. In winter, they were cold enough that a man's breath fogged the air inside. And in summer, they were stifling, with no ventilation and the heat of a dozen working men packed into a space that would have been tight for 3. A wood stove provided the only heat, and whoever was closest to it in January was grateful, and whoever was furthest was not. The beds were infested. Lice were a permanent feature of bunkhouse life, and most cowboys accepted them the way they accepted bad weather, as something the job came with. Personal hygiene on the range was not what a person today would consider hygiene at all. In summer, if there was a stream or a pond nearby, a man might wash once a week. In winter, most simply didn't, and wouldn't seriously consider it until the spring thaw. The smell of a bunkhouse full of working cowboys after a hard week was something that contemporary accounts describe with a candor that does not require elaboration. The men who slept in those bunkhouses were younger than most people imagine. The cowboy workforce was overwhelmingly composed of men in their teens and 20s. Many had come west after the Civil War with no particular prospects and no specific skills beyond a willingness to work hard and ride. By some estimates, at least 1 in 3 cowboys working the trails and ranches of the American West was either black or Mexican. African American freedmen came to the cattle trade in significant numbers after emancipation, in part because racial discrimination, while present, was somewhat less rigid on the open range than it was in other parts of American society. Vaqueros from Texas and northern Mexico brought the skills that made the entire industry possible: the roping techniques, the horsemanship traditions, and the understanding of cattle behavior that Anglo cowboys learned from them and built upon. The social life of the bunkhouse was structured around the limited entertainment available. Cards were common, so was dice. Men swapped stories and traded insults. And one of the more documented traditions of bunkhouse culture was the kangaroo court, a mock trial held for pure entertainment in which a cowboy would be charged with some invented or trivial offense: oversleeping, bad roping, talking too much at breakfast. The accused would be given a dramatic trial by his crewmates, a verdict was delivered with great ceremony, and the punishment, usually something harmless and humiliating like being thrown in the horse trough, was carried out with the full theatrical weight of a proper judicial proceeding. In an environment where entertainment was scarce and humor was a survival tool, the kangaroo court was a pressure valve. It was a way of managing the tension that built up between men living in close quarters under difficult conditions. The actual causes of death on the job were far less dramatic than the legend suggests, but no less grim. Horse-related accidents were among the leading killers. A boot caught in a stirrup, a horse that stumbled and went down at speed, a kick from a frightened animal at close range. These were the things that ended careers and sometimes lives. On the trail, stampedes were a constant threat, and the man in the wrong place when a herd went could be lost before anyone realized he was gone. Lightning, river crossings, and exposure to extreme weather accounted for a significant share of fatalities as well. Infection from injuries that went untreated or were treated without anything that would pass for modern medicine was also a serious and underappreciated danger. A wound that a person today would address with a short course of antibiotics could, in the 1870s, become a life-threatening problem within days. What the historical record does not support is the image of the cowboy dying in a blaze of gunfire over cards, or a woman or a disputed cattle brand. Armed confrontations happened, and they have been documented, but they were not a routine feature of working cowboy life. The men who died young in the cattle trade died from the land, the animals, and the weather. They died from a profession that made extraordinary physical demands and provided almost nothing in return except a wage that barely covered the basics. The diversity of the cowboy workforce, Black, Mexican, Anglo, and Native American men all working the same trails and sleeping in the same bunkhouses, has also been largely erased from the popular image of the era. The Hollywood cowboy is overwhelmingly a white man riding alone. The historical cowboy was more often a young man of mixed or marginalized background who had come to the cattle trade because it was one of the few sectors of the American economy where his labor was genuinely valued, and where the land itself didn't much care who was sitting in the saddle. By the 1880s, the cattle trade had undergone a transformation that most working cowboys felt in their pockets and their sense of their own place in the world. The early years of the trail driving era, from roughly 1866 through the mid-1870s, had been chaotic and expansive, the product of an enormous surplus of Texas cattle and a hungry Eastern market, connected by an extending rail network. Individual ranchers drove their own herds, hired their own men, and operated with a degree of independence that made the business feel, at least in some respects, like a frontier enterprise. That period ended. What replaced it was something considerably more modern and considerably less romantic. By the 1880s, Eastern investors and foreign capital, particularly British and Scottish, had moved into the American cattle industry in significant numbers. They formed large, incorporated ranching companies, brought in professional managers, and imposed the kind of organizational discipline that investors in any era expect when their money is at stake. The cowboy, who had thought of himself as a rough and ready, independent operator, a man defined by his skills and his horse and his personal code, now found himself an employee of a corporation with offices in Chicago or London or Edinburgh. His loyalty was to the brand, but the brand's loyalty was increasingly to the stockholders. The practical consequences were immediate. Corporate ranch owners imposed behavioral restrictions on their hands that an earlier generation of ranchers would have struggled to enforce. No gambling on ranch property, no drinking during the working season. Men who objected were not negotiated with, they were replaced. The cattle trade by the early 1880s had enough surplus labor that a disgruntled cowhand was never hard to substitute. A handful of cowboys in Texas organized and went on strike in 1883, demanding wages of $50 a month and better conditions. The strike failed. The ranchers simply hired other men, and the strikers found themselves blacklisted across the industry. The wages themselves tell the story clearly. A standard ranch hand in this period earned between $25 and $40 a month. The trail boss earned around $100. The cook earned roughly $75. An ordinary cowboy working a full calendar year would bring home somewhere between $300 and nearly $500. And out of that, he was expected to supply his own gear. Boots, chaps, a saddle, which could cost as much as $30 on its own. Work clothes, spurs, and a rope were all the cowboy's personal expense. The horse was usually provided by the ranch, but everything the man wore and carried on his body was his own financial responsibility. What was left after gear was not a living wage by any calculation that takes the difficulty of the work into account. The end of the trail driving era came with a speed that surprised nearly everyone. Barbed wire, patented in 1874 and in widespread use by the early 1880s, closed the open range. As farmers and smaller landowners fenced their properties, the vast, unfenced corridors that the cattle drives depended on began to disappear. Railroads expanded into Texas and the surrounding territories, making it possible to ship cattle directly from origin without driving them hundreds of miles to distant Kansas railheads. And then the winter of 1886 to 1887 arrived. That winter is remembered in the historical record as the Big Die-Up. Temperatures across the northern ranges dropped to extremes that the cattle industry had not previously experienced at scale. Cattle that had been left on the open range, as they always had been, had nowhere to go and nothing to eat. Barbed wire fences that had been built to contain them now held them in place as the blizzards moved through. Across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas, it is estimated that hundreds of thousands of cattle died over the course of that single winter season. Some ranchers lost the majority of their herds. The financial damage to Eastern and European investors was severe enough that it accelerated the end of the large-scale open-range operation far faster than anyone had anticipated. By 1890, the era that has since become synonymous with the American West was effectively over. The open range was fenced. The great trail drives from Texas had ceased. The cattle industry had reorganized around smaller, managed operations with their herds in enclosed pastures and access to rail lines nearby. The cowboy did not disappear entirely. He became a year-round ranch hand, which in many ways was harder and more monotonous than the trail work had been, with less of even the limited camaraderie that the drives had produced. What he was, at the end of all of it, was a man who had been at the center of one of the defining economic episodes of American history, and who had been compensated for that with the absolute minimum the market would allow. No contract, no union, no pension, no recourse. He was an industrial laborer in boots and a wide-brimmed hat, working in conditions that no labor law would have permitted a generation later, on behalf of companies that viewed him as a replaceable part of a larger machine. The myth of the cowboy, the lone rider, the free man, the natural aristocrat of the open plains, was built almost entirely after the fact by novelists and painters and eventually filmmakers who understood that Americans wanted a certain kind of hero. Owen Wister's novel The Virginian, published in 1902, did more to establish the romantic template than any actual cowboy ever could. By the time the dime novels and the Wild West shows had finished with the material, the real working man had been replaced so thoroughly by the fictional one that it became genuinely difficult to remember which came first. He woke before dawn. He ate the same food every day. He slept in a building that leaked, on a bed that bit. He earned less than a factory worker in the same decade, with fewer protections and more ways to die on the job. He did this for years, often until his body gave out, and then he was replaced. That was the cowboy, the whole one, not the edited version. And knowing all of that, knowing exactly what the job actually cost, could you have done it? Drop your answer in the comments below, because I think most of us, if we're being honest with ourselves, already know the answer. If you found this one worth your time, there's a lot more where it came from. Subscribe to the channel and we'll keep going, because the real history of the American West is stranger, harder, and more interesting than any version Hollywood ever put on a screen.